So stereotype threat is a common term that you might have heard of, and I'd like to use this lecture to get a little bit more technical about what that is. So stereotype threat is when a person becomes aware that they could be the target of a stereotype, right? That they may themselves not believe in it, but they are aware that somebody might use it to evaluate or judge them. So that's when the target, so let's say an Asian American person, right, is aware that yes, somebody might use a general Asian American stereotype, or might use a model minority stereotype, or any other parts of the stereotype to look at them. The theory predicts that they will experience a decrease in performance, and they also predict that they might actually decrease in the identification in that stereotype domain. So if the stereotype is about academic performance, they will find that less important. Or if the negative stereotype is about leadership at performance, then they will be less identified, less caring about that domain. And the reason is because it is the awareness that oneself or one's group can be judged according to the stereotype, and the burden of needing to contend with needing to prove somebody wrong all the time, or dealing with the emotional baggage of needing to ignore somebody else's stereotyping, that just grinds on the person, right? Making them perform less well because it's distracting, but it's also making it less decreasing the sense of belonging. So that's a number of mechanisms that lead to stereotype threat, and we'll dig into a little bit more. So stereotype threat is definitely the outcome of many negative stereotypes. Okay, let's get into the mechanism a little bit more. So when you have a negative stereotype that is about you, first thing that happens is that there is a certain level of cognitive disruption that comes from emotional regulation. Most people don't like to be stereotyped, and so when you might be stereotyped, you need to moderate your emotions, right? That you don't want to get annoyed, you don't want to get angry, but one way or the other, you need to pay attention to your emotion and regulate that emotional experience, to not get angry, to not get distracted, to not get annoyed. And to need to attend to that is cognitive disruption. Because best is if you don't have to worry about what other people think of you or what you think of other people think of you. Best is if you can just focus on the work and get it done. But stereotype threat gets in the way that you need to start regulating your emotion. Another thing that stereotype threat does is that it affects a person's regulatory focus. There are two typical regulatory focus. One could have an approach orientation, where you're trying to reach a goal, where you're trying to go towards a target. Or one could have an avoidance orientation, where you're trying to avoid something bad that happens, avoiding a mistake, avoiding fulfilling a stereotype. So stereotype threat leads people to experience more of an avoidance orientation, where I'm trying not to fulfill the goal, trying not to fulfill the stereotype, I'm trying not to make a mistake. And research and performance shows that in general, an avoidance goal is less effective than an approach goal. People perform better, people do better, people feel better while they're doing the job when they're in an approach orientation rather than an avoidance orientation. So 2 strikes already, that stereotype threat causes performance to decrease. The third one is that is how do people attribute for failure? It turns out that when we're all doing things that are difficult, it doesn't always work, right? I mean, if you're doing something new, something challenging, the natural consequence is that sometimes you fail. But how do we explain that failure? You could explain your failure as that maybe you're doing something difficult, doing something challenging. So of course failure is normal. Or you can do an attribution for failure where you would say that, maybe I'm not so good at it. Maybe I just don't, I'm not that interested in it. So if you are making that type of attribution, that is, about that I don't belong, that maybe I'm not that good at it, then you're less likely to persist in doing the task. And what we found is that stereotype threat tends to lead to that type of negative attributions and failure. So people start distancing themselves from this area of performance. Finally, to always need to second guess, right? To always realize that somebody might think negatively of you. Somebody might judge you in a stereotypic way, one way or the other, even if it's a positive stereotype. But, somebody is trying to kind of box you into a particular expectation rather than just treat you as a person. You feel less of a sense of belonging in that space, right? Lack of sense of belonging will lead people to choose to do other things that they are good at, other things that they could do, other things that bring more satisfaction, that bring a greater sense of belonging. So through these mechanisms, stereotype threat lead the person to perform less well and also become less interested in persisting in that field. That's how stereotype threat lead people to, sometimes people call it the leaky pipeline, right? That people start leaving that field because they don't like to deal with the negative stereotype that other people have on them. One thing that is very important in here is that people might not believe in the stereotype. They don't believe in the stereotype at all. But nevertheless, in the situation where they have to deal with that stereotype, when they can't control what other people believe in, one thing they could do is that they can exercise secondary control, right? That I can't control what they think, but I can control my environment. So I'm going to leave this environment. I'm going to disidentify with this domain. So I retain some control of my my immediate environment. There are a few trigger factors. It turns out that the more you care about the domain, right, the more important that particular area of work or achievement is for you, the more likely you will feel stereotype threat. Because if you think about it, it makes sense. If you don't really care about doing that particular task well, you wouldn't be bothered that people have negative stereotypes. You wouldn't be bothered that you might have to prove somebody else wrong, right? You just go about doing your thing and not caring what other people think. But if you care about that domain, whether it's academics, whether it's leadership, whether it's creativity, whether it's relational, the more you care about it, the more you would be bothered by people second guessing you, and hence leading to that counter disruption that we see in stereotype threat. Similarly, the more important that task domain is, the more likely is that you will experience that stereotype threat. Another area is that the greater you feel that there is a strong conflict between those different cultural frames that you have, different identities that you have, right? So the more likely you're going to feel that, I need to prove the other group wrong. I need to I need to deal with this conflict in my identity spaces, and you will feel less of a sense of belonging. Therefore, when you are less acculturated, right, when you have a harder time dealing with that bicultural or multicultural navigation. So that's definitely something important to attend to. Another piece is if you experience historical trauma or racial trauma, the stereotypes would just be more chronically accessible. The stereotypes might be more toxic, right? The emotional burden heavier. And so again, any sign of future rejection or any sign of somebody judging you because of the stereotype that has this historical burden, the more triggering it would be, right? The more likely it would disrupt your performance, the more likely you would not feel that sense of belonging. So that broader historical context definitely matter. Stigma consciousness goes together with being a solo and token, right? That if you're the only person of the identity in that space, or you have been selected and you wonder if you were just like the token minority person or the token numerical minority in various social identities that you've been selected into a group or into a project or committee, the more likely you'll be aware of that stigma. The more likely that you might wonder, will I get judged, right? Will I get judged from that stereotypic perspective? And the stronger the stereotype threat effect will be. Just as there are trigger factors, there are protective factors. So research has found, and actually you've read papers, right, that somehow ethnic identity, ethnic and racial identity development, right, when one has the ability to navigate multiple identity, multiple cultural contexts, not to resolve things, but more to be more comfortable with the conflicts that inherent and be more aware of that those different identity contexts. to have stronger relationship with the multiple identity context, and be able to draw on the resilient social support in those spaces. The more a person is resilient to a lot of these life stresses, right? Whether it is life stresses from domestic violence, life stresses from encountering other forms of violence, and also life stresses that comes from dealing with stereotype threat. So finding the community support, finding the family and individual space to create to create the opportunity for identity developments appears to be important in multiple domains that we've seen in this course so far. Having role models matter a lot. It turns out that if somebody can see that, well, sure, somebody can judge me by the stereotype, but you know what? It's not my job to disprove it because somebody else has done that. And that person is who I want to be like. Right? Having role models in one's life appear to moderate and mitigate the effect of stereotype threat. Another one is institutional trust. That if people, stereotype threat often occur in institutional setting, right? We're talking about work setting. We're talking about social settings where there is an organization. There is an organization, a workplace, and so it turns out that when people are more trusting of that place, right? That again, not seeing that there are no problems, but finding trusted spaces, finding processes that are fair, or ways that you can improve on the processes, that you're part of the community, having the institutional trust that the right things are continually being done, even though when it's not perfect, that mitigates stereotype threat. And I think it's because people know that they're not being judged, right? That you're not going to be judged on one or two performances in whether or not you conform to the stereotype, whether or not you belong. So that definitely, again, think forward about when you will one day be a teacher, one day will be a supervisor. That's an environment that you definitely want to cultivate. Another one is the incremental theory of intelligence and performance. If I think that you're just born so smart and you at some point max out in how smart you are, then I'm very vulnerable to stereotype threat, because at some point I'll figure out something that's difficult to do. And when it's difficult for me, I might think that, well, what if I hit my limit? What if the stereotype wasn't wrong to start with? And research shows that that's not how human performance works. Most of us, under most circumstances, still have a lot of room to grow. I'm not saying that I'm joining the WNBA right now, right? That if I do that, yes, I won't make the team, but I actually still would improve. And I think most of us are not at the point where you are like at that, you're about to join, a professional league, but most of us are doing things that are new to us, that we have a lot of capacity to learn. And if we actually honestly realize that we have a lot of room to grow in most things that we're doing, then we adopt this incremental theory of intelligence and performance, and that is a big protective factor against stereotype threat, because we're no longer worried that if we don't perform well, we're kind of conforming to the stereotype, or we've hit our limit, because we haven't. Right? We just are continuing to grow and continuing to learn new things. So that's definitely one way to counter stereotype threat, both in yourself as well as when you one day will be teaching and mentoring people at work and in your social circle. And the final one is institutional. Final intervention against stereotype threat is having critical mass, having a community is absolutely important, because part of the trigger factor for stereotype threat is that you feel you don't belong. You feel that your experience is a one-time, is a singular experience that doesn't represent everyone else. But when there's a critical mass, you realize, actually, that struggle is pretty normal, and one no longer feels that you are there to fight the stereotype. You don't need to be as annoyed by the stereotype, because at least it's a shared experience, and everyone there is there to who doesn't belong in this believe in the stereotype, and that it mitigates our negative emotional response, and that in itself created more identity safety and reduced the effect of stereotype threat. Right. So all these things together. So reducing trigger factors and enhancing protective factors could be one way that you could think about how to protect from stereotype threat. So take this lecture and think about the readings that you have, right? Especially thinking about the reading in terms of the perpetual foreigner stereotype. What could one do in an organizational setting as well as in a cultural setting to reduce the stereotype threat that is triggered by being seen as a foreigner, being seen as one as not belonging? I'll see you in class.